The desert was silent, except for the whisper of hot wind pushing sand across the stones. It was the kind of silence that pressed on a man's chest and made him feel smaller than dust. Samuel Cain stood alone, sweat dripping into the corners of his cracked lips, his boots planted beside a mound of freshly turned earth. A crude wooden cross, carved with a shaking hand, leaned against the grave. Beneath that shallow grave lay his younger brother, Thomas. The boy had been no more than 21, still too young to carry the kind of burdens men carried in this unforgiving frontier. Now he carried nothing at all, just a body riddled with arrows, wrapped in a torn blanket, swallowed by the desert that had never shown mercy to anyone. Samuel's hands clenched into fists, so tight his nails cut into his own flesh. His eyes, red from both sun and grief, never blinked as he stared at the cross. In his mind, he replayed the horror, the sudden Apache attack, arrows hissing through the air, Thomas falling from the saddle with a cry that would forever echo in Samuel's ears. He hadn't been fast enough. He hadn't been strong enough. And now his blood lay beneath the dirt. Samuel pulled his Colt revolver from its holster and lifted it high against the burning sky. His voice cracked as he shouted, each word echoing across the canyon walls like thunder. By God and by the dust I stand on, I'll kill every Apache I see. I'll wipe their kind from this land, one by one, until their blood fills the desert like rain. The wind caught his words and carried them into the endless horizon. His horse stamped nervously, sensing the storm of hate boiling inside its master. Samuel's oath was not the hollow muttering of grief. It was a vow carved into his soul, as sharp as any blade. The West had no room for half measures. Out here, promises were made with blood, and his promise was vengeance. He holstered his Colt, mounted his horse, and turned toward the distant ridges where smoke curled faintly against the horizon. Somewhere beyond those ridges, the Apaches rode free, their war cries echoing in the canyons. Samuel's jaw tightened. He would hunt them, track them, and break them. He had nothing left to lose, and men with nothing left to lose were the most dangerous kind. Yet, as he rode away, the desert itself seemed to whisper warnings. The sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer, relentless and punishing. Vultures circled above, as if mocking his vow, waiting for him to fall and join his brother beneath the sand. The land had seen men like him before, men who carried hate like a torch through dry grass. And always, always, the fire consumed them in the end. But Samuel didn't hear the warning. All he felt was rage. All he saw was red. Every cactus thorn, every jagged rock seemed to sharpen his fury. He pushed his horse harder, faster, as if speed alone could bridge the gap between him and vengeance. The desert sun dipped lower, painting the sky in blood-red streaks. Samuel Cain rode on, a man transformed by grief into a weapon of wrath. His brother's death had given him a purpose, and that purpose was destruction. What Samuel could not know, not yet, was that the oath he had sworn would not end the way he imagined. The desert had a cruel way of twisting men's paths, of turning vows inside out. The same land that had taken his brother would soon force him to face a truth he could not yet bear. For though he had sworn to kill every Apache he saw, one day, out in this endless wilderness, an Apache would save his life. The trail was long, and Samuel Cain rode it with eyes that burned like embers in a dying fire. Each hoofbeat of his weary horse struck the earth like a drumbeat of war. He carried no smile, no softness, only a revolver on his hip and a hunger in his chest that no food could ease. Hunger for revenge. For weeks, Samuel tracked signs of Apache movement across the desert. He became a man of the dust, reading the land the way some men read books. A broken arrowhead, half buried in sand, smoke rising faintly on the horizon. A scrap of horsehair caught on thorn brushes were his clues. And with each one, he whispered to himself, "Closer. I'm getting closer." His nights were spent under an endless sky, the stars bright enough to cut through the darkness. Yet sleep rarely came. Instead, he stared upward, replaying Thomas's death again and again, cursing his own survival. The desert winds carried the echo of his vow, "Kill them all. Leave none alive." It was a promise that haunted his dreams and drove him forward when his body cried out for rest. One evening, Samuel found himself at a campfire not his own. A circle of bounty hunters huddled around the flames, their shadows stretching long against the rock walls. They were rough men, scarred and hollow-eyed, carrying rifles that had ended many lives. They welcomed him in silence, for silence was the language of killers. As the fire popped and cracked, stories began to flow, grim tales of Apache raids. A ranch burned to ash with its family inside. A settler's wagon train ambushed, the survivors left to the buzzards. Every tale was told with spitting anger, every word dripping with hatred. Samuel listened, and with each story, the fire in his chest grew hotter. But then, as the night deepened, one voice rose softer than the rest. It belonged to an old man with a face carved by time, his eyes sunken but sharp. He spoke slowly, carefully, like a man who had seen more graves than sunrises. "Careful, boy," the old hunter rasped, staring into the flames. "Hate's a horse you can't ride forever. It'll buck you off in the indand. When it does, you'll land in the same dirt you're diggin' for others." The words struck Samuel like a stray bullet. For a moment, his jaw tightened, and he glanced at the man. He wanted to argue, to curse him for weakness. But the old hunter said no more, only puffed his pipe and stared at the glowing embers. Samuel's fingers toyed with the handle of his Colt. He felt the warning in his bones, but shoved it aside. Weak men gave warnings. Strong men kept promises. And Samuel Cain had made a promise carved in blood. When dawn came, he saddled up without a word. The bounty hunters vanished into the hills, seeking their own prey, but Samuel had his path. The desert stretched before him, endless and merciless, as if daring him to continue. His horse groaned beneath him, ribs showing from too many miles and too little feed. But Samuel pushed onward. He thought of Thomas's face, pale in the firelight of that last night, eyes wide with terror before the arrow struck. The memory burned sharper than whiskey, and he clung to it like a spur digging into his side. The sun climbed high, baking the land into a furnace. Sweat ran into Samuel's eyes, but still he searched, scanning ridges and gullies for the faintest sign of his enemy. He would not stop. He could not stop. Somewhere ahead, the Apaches rode, and Samuel Cain swore the land itself would run red when he found them. The desert dawn broke, sharp and cold. the kind of morning where the sky glowed pale blue and the land itself held its breath. Samuel Cain crouched low behind a jagged boulder, his rifle steady across his knee. From his perch, he had the hunters in sight, a small Apache party winding through the canyon below. There were 4 of them, riding bareback with the ease of men born in the saddle. Their hair streamed behind them in the wind, their ponies stepping carefully over loose stones. They were hunters, not warriors, carrying bows and spears. Speaking to one another in low voices, Samuel could not understand. To Samuel, it didn't matter. Apache was Apache. Enemy was enemy. And this was the moment he had hunted for since the day he buried his brother. His pulse hammered in his ears, louder than the desert silence. He steadied his breath, lined the sights, and whispered to himself for Thomas. The crack of his rifle shattered the stillness. One rider jerked backward and fell from his horse in a cloud of dust. Chaos erupted instantly. The others shouted, their ponies whinnying and rearing as arrows flashed upward toward Samuel's hiding place. He worked the lever of his rifle and fired again. A second man toppled from the saddle, his body rolling lifelessly across the rocks. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air, mixing with the sweat dripping down Samuel's face. An arrow whistled past his head. Another struck the boulder beside him, splintering stone into his cheek. He cursed, ducked low, and drew his revolver, firing wild into the dust below. The canyon became a storm of sound, hooves pounding, war cries echoing, rifle fire and arrows cutting the air. Samuel felt one arrow slice across his arm, hot pain blooming instantly. Blood soaked his sleeve, but rage drowned out the sting by the time the dust began to settle. 3 Apache hunters lay still, their bodies sprawled across the canyon floor. Their horses scattered, neighing in panic as they bolted into the distance. The last man had fled into the rocks, his shadow vanishing like smoke. Samuel stood, chest heaving, revolver smoking in his hand. His arm burned, his shirt sticky with blood, but a grim smile spread across his cracked lips. This was vengeance. This was justice. For Thomas, he staggered down the slope, boots crunching over loose stones, until he stood over the fallen. They were young, too young. One barely looked old enough to grow a beard. Samuel stared at their still faces, and for a moment, something in his chest twisted. He tried to summon triumph, but the desert gave him only silence. The rage inside him flickered. He told himself they deserved it, that he was evening the score. Yet the hollow in his gut only grew. His horse shifted nervously when he returned to the ridge, sensing its master's unease. Samuel tied a strip of cloth around his bleeding arm and mounted. He told himself the pain didn't matter, that this was just the first step. But as the sun rose higher, burning away the morning chill, Samuel realized revenge was not filling him, it was carving him out. Each death left him emptier than before, like the desert itself was swallowing him piece by piece. Still, he rode on. The oath demanded more blood, and Samuel Cain would not rest until it was spilled. The desert had a way of punishing men who thought themselves stronger than it. Samuel Cain learned that truth in the days following the ambush. At first, he rode hard, his wounded arm bound with a strip of cloth, blood seeping through, but ignored. His horse carried him across endless dunes and jagged ridges, the sun bearing down like the eye of an angry God. Samuel told himself he was winning, that he was closer to vengeance. But the desert knew better. By the third day, his canteen was nearly dry. The little water he had tasted of metal, warm as bath water, but he drank it greedily all the same. His lips cracked, his tongue swelled, and each swallow felt like swallowing gravel. His horse stumbled more often, ribs showing with each shallow breath. Then came the moment that stripped Samuel bare. The horse's hoof caught a rock, and it went down hard, throwing him into the sand. Samuel rolled, coughing, then scrambled back to his feet just in time to see his last skin of water burst open beneath the animal's weight. The liquid soaked into the sand before his eyes, vanishing faster than he could blink. Samuel roared, clawing at the dirt with his hands, as if he could gather it back. His throat burned with dust, his vision blurred with rage. But there was nothing, just a dark stain fading into the earth, leaving him with nothing but thirst. The horse lay still, sides heaving, its eyes dull with exhaustion. Samuel patted its neck, muttering, "Come on, boy, not now." But the animal gave one final shuddering breath and was gone. Now he was alone. The desert stretched in every direction, endless waves of sand and stone, the horizon quivering in the heat. Samuel staggered forward on foot, carrying only his revolver, his rifle slung uselessly across his back. Each step was torture, each breath like inhaling fire. The sun blistered his skin until it peeled, raw and burning. His boots filled with sand, grinding his feet raw with every mile. His thoughts began to tangle. At times, he saw shapes moving on the ridge's figures, watching him, whispers on the wind. Sometimes it was Apaches, sometimes it was Thomas, calling to him from beyond the grave. At night, the desert turned cruel in another way. The heat fled, replaced by a chill that cut through his bones. Samuel wrapped his coat around himself, shivering, staring at stars that looked sharp enough to slice the sky open. He whispered to the dark, "I'll keep my oath. I'll keep it." But even his voice sounded thin, like it no longer believed. By the fifth day, his body gave out. His knees buckled, sending him sprawling into the dust. He crawled for a while, dragging himself with bleeding hands across rocks that tore his palms. Vultures circled above, black specks growing larger with each passing hour. At last, Samuel collapsed beneath a jagged outcropping of stone. The little shade it offered a cruel mockery of mercy. His revolver slipped from his grasp, landing in the sand beside him. His lips were split, bleeding, his throat so dry he could not swallow. He closed his eyes, whispering hoarsely, "If death comes, let it be quick." But death did not come. Not yet. A shadow fell across him, tall, silent, and unexpected. Samuel forced his eyes open, and through the haze he saw a rider, a man on horseback. An Apache Dot, the figure dismounted slowly, water gourd in hand, approaching the fallen cowboy. Samuel's fingers twitched toward his revolver, but his strength was gone. All he could do was watch as the stranger knelt beside him, lifting the gourd toward his lips in the furnace of the desert. Where hate had kept him alive this long, Samuel Cain tasted mercy for the first time. The line between life and death had thinned to a thread. Samuel Cain lay sprawled in the sand, his breath shallow, eyes half shut. The desert had stripped him of everything: his horse, his water, even his will to keep crawling. All that remained was the vow, echoing faintly in his mind. Kill every Apache you see. So, when the shadow fell across him, his broken heart clenched with one last surge of hate through the haze of heat. He saw the figure, a man astride a sturdy pony, dark hair loose around his shoulders, the feathers and beads of an Apache warrior catching the light of the sun. Samuel tried to move, tried to reach for the revolver lying in the sand beside him, but his arm felt like lead. His strength was gone. The warrior dismounted. He moved carefully, like a man approaching a wounded animal, not an enemy. In his hand he carried a small gourd. Kneeling beside Samuel, he pressed it against the cowboy's lips. At first, Samuel resisted. Pride clawed at him, whispering that he should spit in the man's face, die with his hate intact. But thirst is stronger than pride. His cracked lips opened, and warm water touched his tongue. He drank greedily, choking, until the warrior pulled the gourd away. Enough, the man said in halting English, his voice calm but firm. Samuel coughed, water dripping down his chin, his vision sharpening just enough to study his savior. The Apache's face was strong, his eyes steady. Not the savage demon Samuel had painted in his mind, but a man, flesh, blood, and weary like any other. The warrior pointed to himself. Tekoda, he said. The word carried weight, as though it meant more than a name. Later, Samuel would learn its meaning. Friend to all. Tekoda tore strips from his own tunic, binding Samuel's festering arm wound with a mixture of herbs and resin that smelled sharp and earthy. Samuel hissed at the sting but made no protest. He had no strength left to fight. Through the night, Tekoda stayed by his side. He built a small fire beneath the rock outcropping, its smoke curling into the star-filled sky. He shared food-dried meat and mesquite, beans, placing them in Samuel's trembling hands. The cowboy chewed slowly, every bite tasting like salvation. Yet as Samuel's body began to recover, his mind twisted in turmoil. This man should be my enemy, he thought. He should have left me to the vultures. But Tekoda had saved him, not once, but again and again, with water, food, and care. At one point, Samuel rasped through cracked lips, "Why? Why not let me die?" Tekoda stirred the fire, the flames lighting his face. "Hate is a circle," he said simply. "Someone must step out." The words struck Samuel deeper than any bullet could. Hate had carried him across deserts, driven him to spill blood. And now, lying weak and broken, the man he had sworn to kill was the one keeping him alive. As dawn crept across the desert, painting the horizon in gold, Samuel watched Tekoda prepare the horses. For the first time since Thomas's death, his oath felt less like a shield and more like a chain. Samuel closed his eyes, torn between gratitude and rage, wondering which one would win when he had the strength to choose. The desert has no mercy, but it does have lessons. For Samuel Cain, those lessons came day by day in the company of the very man he had once sworn to kill. Tekoda moved like he belonged to the land. He could find water in places Samuel would have sworn were barren. He could read the faintest tracks rabbit, coyote, or deer etched across the sand. He showed Samuel how to strip bark from a mesquite tree and chew it to ease thirst. How to dig for roots when hunger gnawed at first. Samuel spoke little. He was a man built of walls, and hate had been his mortar. But silence wears on even the hardest souls, and Tokota's patience was steady as stone. He never pressed, never mocked. He simply taught, guided, and watched. One evening, they camped beside a shallow creek that shimmered like silver under the moon. Samuel sat with his revolver across his knees, staring at the water. Tokota skinned a rabbit with practiced hands, roasting it over a small fire. Finally, Samuel broke the silence. His voice was rough, like unused leather. "Why save me? After what I've done? After what I swore to do?" Tokota looked at him, eyes reflecting firelight. "You are a man," he said simply, "not different from me. Your brother, my brother, both taken. If I let you die, hate wins again." The words stung Samuel's pride. He wanted to argue, to spit back, that Apaches had started it, that his brother's blood demanded revenge. But the truth sat heavy in his gut. He had killed men, young hunters, who were no more soldiers than Thomas had been. Blood had answered blood, and it hadn't eased his pain. For a long while, neither spoke. The fire crackled. Coyotes howled in the distance. Samuel's hand drifted to his arm, now healing beneath Tokota's herbs. He thought of the old bounty hunter's warning, "Hate's a horse you can't ride forever." Perhaps the man had been right. As days passed, the line between enemies blurred. Samuel began to ask questions, cautious at first, then more freely. He learned that Tokota had lost his wife and child in a raid by soldiers, burned out of their village for land they would never see again. Pain answered pain on both sides, leaving two men who carried ghosts in their hearts. Once, as they tracked a mule deer across the ridge, Samuel muttered, "Maybe the land's cursed. Maybe it wants us dead." Tokota shook his head. "The land is not cursed. Men curse themselves with greed and anger. The land only watches." Samuel said nothing, but the words dug deep. One night, while the wind whipped sand across the desert floor, Tokota shared tobacco, passing the pipe between them. Samuel hesitated, then took a drag, coughing hard at the sharp smoke. Tokota laughed, a deep, warm laugh, and for the first time in months, Samuel almost smiled in the glow of that fire. He felt the chain of his oath loosening, if only by a link. Still, the war inside him raged. Each time he looked at Tokota, gratitude wrestled with rage. The man was his savior, his teacher, and yet, by Samuel's own vow, he should have been his victim. As the fire burned low, Samuel stared into the embers and whispered to himself, "Enemies or brothers?" The desert wind gave no answer, but the stars above seemed to watch more closely than before. The bond between Samuel Kane and Tokota was fragile, like glass balanced on a stone. It held, but the desert was never still for long. And fate had a way of testing men when they least expected it. It happened on the third week of their uneasy companionship. They were traveling through a narrow canyon, its walls towering like prison bars on either side. Samuel rode ahead, scanning the ridgelines, while Tokota guided his pony with quiet confidence. The sun was high, baking the rock until it glowed like fire. Then came the sound, a sharp crack of a rifle echoing through the canyon. A bullet spat dust near Samuel's boot. His horse reared, and he fought to steady it. More gunfire followed, bouncing between the walls. Outlaws from the shadows above. Riders appeared, dragged men with bandanas across their faces, guns flashing in the sunlight. Bandits, not soldiers, not Apache, just killers, hungry for whatever they could take. And to them, Samuel and Tokoda looked like easy prey. "Get down," Samuel shouted, diving for cover behind a cluster of rocks. Tokoda slid from his pony in one swift motion, bow in hand, an arrow notched before Samuel had even leveled his revolver. The canyon erupted with chaos. Bullets screamed. Dust and gun smoke filled the air. Samuel fired, dropping one outlaw from the ridge. Another leaped down, charging with a knife. But Tokoda's arrow found his chest before he reached the ground for the first time. Samuel fought not against Tokoda, but beside him. Their movements, though unplanned, fell into rhythm. Samuel's revolver barked with thunder, while Tokoda's bow whispered death. Together they cut through the outlaws like two edges of the same blade. But the fight was not without cost. A bullet grazed Samuel's ribs, hot pain tearing through him. He staggered, almost falling, until Tokoda's hand gripped his shoulder, steadying him. Their eyes met for a brief second. They would live or die as one. The bandits pressed harder, their leader shouting curses as he reloaded behind a boulder. Samuel gritted his teeth, snapping his rifle to his shoulder. "Cover me," he barked. Tokoda nodded, loosing arrows swift as lightning, forcing the outlaws to duck. Samuel seized the moment, stepping into the open. He fired once, twice, both shots true. The leader crumpled, his revolver clattering to the dirt. Silence followed, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the slow drip of blood into the sand. The surviving bandits fled, spurring their horses until they vanished into the shimmering horizon. Samuel leaned against a rock, chest heaving, blood soaking his shirt. His revolver trembled in his grip. Tokoda knelt beside him, checking the wound with quick hands. "Not deep," he said. "You will live." Samuel managed a dry laugh, wincing. "Thanks to you." It was the first time he had said those words and meant them. Gratitude, untainted by pride, spilled into the space between them. Tokoda gave a small nod, as if nothing more needed saying. That night they camped on the canyon rim. Samuel sat by the fire, his body aching, but his thoughts heavier still. He had once sworn to kill every Apache he saw, yet today he had stood shoulder to shoulder with one bled beside him, trusted him with his life. As the stars wheeled above, Samuel whispered into the flames, "Maybe I've been riding the wrong horse all along." Tokoda heard, but said nothing. He only looked at Samuel with quiet eyes, as though he already knew the truth Samuel was just beginning to face. The desert has a way of burning the lies out of a man. Weeks of hardship, blood, and silence had stripped Samuel Cain bare. What remained was not the bitter gunslinger who once swore vengeance on every Apache he sit, was something different, something new. The morning after the canyon battle, Samuel and Tokoda rode eastward, following the faint outline of wagon ruts across the hard earth. Samuel's wound pulled with each breath, but the pain felt like a reminder, proof that he had survived, not alone, but with Tokoda's hand steadying him. By dusk, they came upon a small settlement. Smoke curled from chimneys, children's laughter echoed faintly, and a church bell told the hour. To ordinary eyes, it was just another frontier town, but to Samuel, it looked like a chance to start over or to fall back into the same cycle of hate. The townsfolk watched as the two riders approached, a cowboy scarred by the desert and an Apache warrior side by side. Suspicion hardened faces, hands hovered near holstered pistols, whispers hissed through the crowd. Samuel felt the tension coil like a rattler, ready to strike. At the saloon, trouble found them quick. A man in a dusty coat stood from his table, his voice cutting through the din. "That one," he spat, pointing at Dakota. "He's Apache. My kin were butchered by his kind. Ain't no place for him here." The room stirred, mutters of agreement, boots scraping against wood. Samuel felt the old fire rise in his chest, the same hate he had once carried, now reflected in another man's eyes. Dakota said nothing. He only stood tall, meeting their stares with quiet dignity. Samuel's hand drifted toward his revolver. But this time, it wasn't rage guiding him. It was choice. He stepped forward, placing himself between Dakota and the angry crowd. "No," Samuel said, his voice low but firm. "This man saved my life. He bled beside me when outlaws tried to gun us down. If you think you're better than him, then you best prove it to me first." The saloon fell silent. The man in the dusty coat faltered, his bravado withering under Samuel's cold stare. No one else moved. In that moment, Samuel Kane, once fueled by vengeance, had drawn a line in the sand, not against Apaches, but against blind hatred itself. Slowly, the tension drained. The man sat down, muttering curses. The crowd dispersed, leaving only Dakota and Samuel standing at the center of the quiet saloon. Later that night, as they camped beyond the edge of town, Samuel spoke softly. "I swore once to kill every Apache I saw, but I was wrong. I see that now. I was riding hate, and it near drove me into the grave." Dakota looked at him, eyes reflecting the firelight. "And now?" Samuel stared into the flames, the weight of his vow lifting like smoke into the night sky. "Now I swear something different. I swear no more blood between us. Not by my hand. Not if I can help it." The desert wind stirred, carrying away the last echoes of Samuel's old oath. In its place came silence, and in that silence, redemption. Side by side, Samuel Kane and Dakota sat beneath the stars. Not enemies, not yet brothers, but something stronger, the beginning of peace, carved out in the dust of the Old West.